Ever think about how, like, an artist's personal life can actually lead to, like, real changes out in the world?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Today, we're going to dive deep into how artists who talked openly about having HIV, how they reshaped how everyone thought about HIV and AIDS.
Hmm.
We've got some excerpts from a longer piece about this, and
Nice.
it's really surprising how these personal stories changed. Like how the public saw things, how art was made, and even activism. So get ready for some unexpected connections
Yeah.
and a whole new way to see how powerful art and just talking about personal stuff can be.
Of course, we got to be sensitive with this topic, someone's HIV status. It's super personal, and we never say anyone has to share that publicly.
Right, right. It's all about respecting what people choose to do and understanding how big of a deal it is to decide to share something like that.
Yeah.
And that's why we're focusing on artists who they chose to talk about their experiences, right?
Right.
And it's amazing how their courage really got those important conversations about HIV and AIDS going
Absolutely.
and helped to challenge all those stereotypes that were out there.
Hmm.
So let's go back, way back to the early 1980s, a time when HIV/AIDS was still like this scary, mysterious thing.
Yeah.
And that's where we run into Rock Hudson. He was a huge Hollywood star.
Well, yeah.
And his story, it really shook the world.
Oh, for sure. Rock Hudson was like a major star back in Hollywood's golden age.
Yeah.
Like, think Cary Grant, but maybe even more charming.
Right, right.
And when he was diagnosed with AIDS back in '84, a lot of people, they hadn't even heard of the disease,
Wow.
let alone understood it.
I can only imagine what a shock that was, not just for Hollywood, but for everyone. It was such a different time, wasn't it?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
His diagnosis, and then when he passed away in '85,
Mm-hmm.
it forced everyone to start having these really hard conversations.
Yeah.
And it brought the whole issue out into the open. People started asking all these questions about this mysterious illness.
She was like, this very personal tragedy actually helped move the conversation forward.
Yeah,
Even though there was so much fear and confusion at the time.
exactly. His story was really sad, but it made people more aware.
Mm.
And what's really important, it got more money for research,
Right.
which was super crucial in those early days of fighting the epidemic.
It's crazy how one person's story can have such a huge impact,
Yeah.
especially when they have a platform like Hollywood to amplify their voice.
Absolutely.
And speaking of platforms that can really get a message out there, let's talk about Freddie Mercury,
Oh, yeah.
the legendary lead singer of Queen.
Such a legend.
His death from AIDS-related complications in '91, that was a huge moment for everyone, wasn't it?
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Freddie Mercury was a global icon,
Mm-hmm.
known for that incredible voice,
Oh, yeah.
the way he owned the stage,
Right.
and those unforgettable songs. I mean, Queen, they were huge, and they still are.
Hmm.
But what's interesting is that even though Freddie himself didn't publicly say he had HIV while he was alive,
Yeah.
his death really made a difference in how people talked about the disease.
It makes you think about the legacy that artists leave behind and how their impact, it just keeps going,
Yeah.
even after they're gone. What kind of changes did you see after his death?
Well, we saw a lot more people looking for information about HIV and AIDS,
Mm-hmm.
and people started challenging the prejudices
Yeah.
that were out there.
Right.
And something really important, people started actively supporting those who were affected.
Yeah.
It was a real turning point in how the public thought about HIV and AIDS.
Wow. That's really powerful. A single event,
Yeah.
as tragic as it was,
Hmm.
managed to change the dialogue and make space for those more open and honest conversations. So, from music, let's switch over to the visual arts and
Come on.
talk about Keith Haring. His work always seems so full of life and energy,
Oh, Haring, yeah, his work, right away, the graffiti style and those bold images.
Mm.
But what I find really inspiring is how he used his art to fight for what he believed in.
Right.
He didn't shy away from the tough topics.
Yeah.
And he was very open about having HIV.
And how did that openness, how did that show up in his art?
Right.
Did it become a main theme?
Totally.
Yeah.
He put those themes of awareness and support right into his pieces.
Wow.
It was like a visual conversation about HIV and AIDS.
Yeah.
And he didn't stop there.
Right.
He was active in educational campaigns,
Wow.
using his art to reach more people
Yeah.
and make a real difference.
So he wasn't just an artist reflecting on something personal.
Oh,
He
yeah.
was an activist using his art to educate and fight for change. It's amazing how he brought those two worlds together.
Absolutely.
Now, this takes us to another really fascinating story, Robert Mapplethorpe.
Mm.
He was a photographer known for his sometimes controversial work, wasn't he?
That's right. His photography was all black and white,
Right.
and it often pushed the boundaries.
Yeah.
He explored themes of sexuality, identity, the human form in ways that challenged what people thought was normal.
Mm.
And it really got people talking and sometimes arguing.
It makes me wonder if that was like on purpose. Did he want to provoke those conversations?
Right.
Or was that just like a natural outcome of his art?
It's tough to say for sure.
Yeah.
But what we do know is that when he passed away from AIDS-related complications in '89,
Right.
it really fueled these discussions about censorship, artistic freedom,
Yeah.
and what role art should play in society.
So even though he was gone, his work kept challenging those conventions
Yep.
and pushing the limits of what people thought was acceptable.
Yeah.
And now, stepping into the world of hip-hop, we've got Eazy-E, a founding member of NWA. His story feels especially powerful given what was going on culturally at the time.
Oh, yeah. Eazy-E was a real force in the music industry.
Huh.
His lyrics, they were raw,
Mm-hmm.
and he had this entrepreneurial spirit that made him a pioneer of gangsta rap.
Right.
When he died from AIDS-related complications in '95, it was a huge shock to the hip-hop community and beyond.
Yeah.
It was a big loss.
Mm-hmm.
And it really brought the issue of HIV and AIDS right to the forefront in a community that, well, let's just say they weren't always known for being open about these kinds of sensitive topics.
It makes you think, did him being open about his diagnosis help break down some of those barriers? You know, encourage more honest conversations within hip-hop, especially about how HIV was affecting the community?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something researchers and cultural commentators have been debating for years. There's no doubt that Eazy-E deciding to go public with his diagnosis, it was a huge moment.
Mm-hmm.
It challenged a lot of assumptions.
Right.
It made the disease more human.
Yeah.
And it forced a lot of people to confront their own biases and fears.
Right. Yeah, it really makes you think about how important those conversations are, especially in communities where, you know, there's so much stigma that keeps people from getting help and support.
Right, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Eazy's decision, it caused some debate.
Yeah.
What were some of the different ways people saw it?
Well, some folks, they really admired his courage and saw it as like a powerful way to push back against all that stigma around HIV and AIDS, you know.
Yeah.
But others, they felt like the timing of his announcement, like it being so close to his death,
Mm-hmm.
it brought up some tricky questions about privacy and consent.
Yeah, that's a really tough issue.
Yeah.
It shows how hard it can be to make personal choices when you're in the public eye,
For sure.
especially when it's about something as sensitive as your health.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's move on to Pedro Zamora, who really used the power of media to raise awareness.
Right.
He was on MTV's The Real World, San Francisco.
He was, yep.
Yeah.
And he was so brave to share what it was like living with HIV on national TV.
Yeah.
What made his story so powerful was that he was so young and so open about everything he was going through.
Yeah.
He really helped people see the human side of the epidemic.
I can see how that would have been so important, especially in the early 90s when there were still so many misconceptions and fear about HIV and AIDS.
Exactly. Pedro challenged stereotypes. He talked about safer sex, and he really pushed for compassion and understanding.
Mm-hmm.
He was such a strong voice for change, especially for young people.
You know, it's interesting to think about how different generations have experienced the HIV/AIDS epidemic. You know, for someone like me, Pedro Zamora was like a familiar face, someone who made the issue feel real and personal.
Right.
But for people who were older, it might have been Rock Hudson or Freddie Mercury who first brought the epidemic to their attention.
That's a really good point. It shows how things change over time
Yeah.
and how different people become important figures for different generations.
And it shows how important it is to have lots of different voices and stories in the conversation about HIV and AIDS.
Mm.
Speaking of powerful voices, let's talk about Jonathan Larson, the amazing creator of the musical Rent.
Oh, yeah. Rent.
His story's a little different, isn't it?
Yeah. It is sadly Jonathan Larson passed away before Rent became the huge hit it is today.
Right.
But his work really made a difference in raising awareness about AIDS and LGBTQ plus issues. Rent brought those conversations to Broadway and way beyond, touching so many lives.
It's such a powerful piece of theater.
It
It
is.
really captures all those raw emotions, the struggles, and the resilience of a community dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis.
It really does. And
Hmm.
while there's some debate about whether Larson himself had HIV, the impact of his work is undeniable.
Right.
Rent used art to make a statement about society. It showed the human side of people affected by AIDS, and it encouraged empathy and understanding.
You know, when you think about it, so many of the artists we've talked about today, they use their art form to shine a light on these difficult topics.
Mhm.
It's like art becomes a way to process those tough emotions, to share what they're going through, and to connect with others on a deeper level.
I totally agree. Art can be so powerful in that way.
Yeah.
It can give a voice to those who don't have one. It can challenge the way things are, and it can inspire people to feel empathy and take action.
And sometimes those voices can lead to real change, not just in our culture, but in policies and public health, too.
Hmm.
Didn't we see something similar with Ryan White, the young boy who got HIV from a blood transfusion?
Absolutely. Ryan White's story is a perfect example of how sharing your story publicly, even when it's hard and painful,
Yeah.
can lead to positive change in the world. His willingness to talk openly about what he was going through, it challenged the stigma around HIV and AIDS
Right.
and showed everyone that it could affect anyone, not just certain groups.
I remember learning about Ryan White in school. His story really stayed with me, but I didn't realize how big of an impact he had. What kind of changes did his advocacy lead to?
Well, for one, his work was a big reason the Ryan White Care Act was passed, which was a groundbreaking law in the United States.
I've heard of that, but I'm not really sure what it does. Can you explain it a bit?
Sure. The Ryan White Care Act, it provides essential services and support for people living with HIV and AIDS.
Okay.
It makes sure they have access to health care, medications, housing, and other really important resources.
Wow.
It's a real testament to how powerful one person's voice can be in creating lasting change.
That's incredible. It shows that even when things are really tough, individual stories can have a ripple effect, leading to real improvements in people's lives.
Yeah.
And thinking about that ripple effect, we've talked a lot about artists and advocates,
Right.
but we've also seen public figures from other fields step up and use their platform to raise awareness.
Yeah.
Magic Johnson comes to mind. His announcement in 1991 was a huge moment, wasn't it?
It really was. Magic Johnson, a basketball legend, announcing that he had HIV was a game changer, especially within the African-American community.
Yeah.
It helped to make people less afraid of the disease,
Yep.
and it encouraged more open conversations about HIV prevention and treatment.
And hasn't he continued to be an advocate for HIV and AIDS awareness and prevention?
He has, yeah. His ongoing activism and the work he does with his foundation have made a big impact, raising awareness, promoting testing, and advocating for better access to care and treatment.
It's inspiring to see how these people from all different backgrounds and walks of life have used their voices to create positive change.
It really is.
So we've looked at all these different personal stories, each one having its own unique impact on the conversation about HIV and AIDS. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some of the key things we can learn about the power of speaking out publicly?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think one of the most important takeaways is that sharing your story publicly when it's your own choice and you're doing it freely can be an incredibly powerful way to create social change. It can help reduce stigma, raise awareness, encourage empathy and support, and promote advocacy.
And we've seen those four elements in all the stories we've discussed today, haven't we?
We have?
From challenging those misconceptions to pushing for new laws, these personal stories have really changed how we understand and address HIV and AIDS.
They absolutely have.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that we all have a part to play in continuing this important work.
What do you mean by that? What can we do as individuals to help create a more just and compassionate world for those affected by HIV and AIDS?
Well, it all starts with education. We need to stay informed about the facts, challenge misinformation, and advocate for policies that support those living with HIV and AIDS.
So it's not just about awareness, it's about actually taking action and using our voices to make a difference.
Exactly. And it's about showing compassion and understanding.
That's so true. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just, listen and learn and be there for the people around us.
Yeah.
We've talked about so much in this deep dive, and it's really amazing how these artists, just choosing to share their stories, it had this ripple effect. It changed how people saw things, it inspired activism, and it even influenced, actual laws. It really shows how powerful art can be in making a difference.
It does. It makes you wonder what other examples are out there.
Yeah.
Where else have we seen art and activism come together to create real change?
That's a great question. I'm thinking about movements like Black Lives Matter.
Right.
And how Music and visual arts have played such a big role in getting those messages out there.
Oh, absolutely. Like, think about all those murals that went up all over the world after George Floyd was killed.
Right.
Those were powerful, powerful statements, showing solidarity and demanding justice.
Mm.
And music, it's always been a driving force in social movements, from the civil rights era to the protests happening today.
It's like art can give a voice to the people who aren't being heard
Yeah,
and create this sense of shared experience. Even when things are tough and people are divided, it can spark conversations, make people think, and ultimately lead to action.
exactly. And it's not just about those big gestures or famous artists either. It's about those everyday creative things we all do,
Right.
the things that connect us and inspire us to make the world better.
So whether it's a song or a painting or a poem or a movie or even just a conversation,
Yeah,
we all have the power to use our voices and our creativity to make a difference.
absolutely.
Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive. And I gotta say, this has been such an insightful conversation.
Yes.
We've learned about these artists who were so brave in sharing their experiences with HIV and AIDS, and we've seen how their personal stories created this ripple effect, changing how people saw things, inspiring activism, and even influencing public policy. It's a testament to the power of art to really make a difference in the world.
It's been great exploring this topic with you.
Yeah.
I hope our listeners now understand more about the power of art, how important it is to have the freedom to make personal choices, and the lasting impact of these brave individuals.
And I want to leave our listeners with this. Knowing what you know now, do you think art has a responsibility to tackle those tough social issues? What other examples can you think of where art and activism have come together to create meaningful change? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another insightful exploration.